started in the dark with a headache so severe, it crossed into something that even doctors cannot explain. By the end of the day, his mind was simply gone. Days later, his family was preparing his funeral. But this story isn't about how close he came to dying. It is about what he claims saw when his mind was not functioning, when there should have been nothing to see. And this is where things get interesting. Now, before we get into it, comment below if you are team believer or team skeptic, because that is exactly what Eben Alexander was. He was a skeptic and he was a doctor. Now, this is not just any type of doctor. It's a type of doctor that other doctors admire. He was a neurosurgeon, trained at top institutions, spent more than 15 years teaching at Harvard Medical School, a man who had built his entire life around one belief, that the brain is the thing that creates the mind, that consciousness is nothing more than electrical activity, and if the brain stops, you stop. This wasn't speculation to him, this was fact. But underneath that certainty, there was a thing that most people didn't see, because long before the coma, there was a fracture. He had been adopted as a baby. For the first 4 months of his life, he wasn't held by a mother. He lived in essentially a hospital-like dorm, a baby dorm, and even though he grew up in a loving home and was adopted by a loving family, he would later describe this as leaving something deeper, a scar, something described as a subconscious question. Am I actually wanted? The question followed him into adulthood, and over time, it evolved into something quietly bigger, a quiet loss of faith. Years later, that fraction widened. After trying and failing to reconnect with his biological family, he reached a breaking point. He stopped praying, stopped going to church, and stopped believing that anything existed beyond this physical realm which we are in. By his own description, he became what he referred to as a materialistic neuroscience, someone who believed that reality began and ended with the brain. Then came the day that changed everything. November the 10th, 2008. At around 4:30 in the morning, he woke up. He had severe back pain, a crushing headache. This wasn't just normal pain. This was the type of pain that signals that something is really wrong. Within hours, his condition began to spiral. He became confused, disorientated, and then unresponsive. Soon after that, the seizures started. By the time he reached the hospital, the doctors realized that they were dealing with something rare, extremely rare, a bacterial infection attacking the brain. E. coli meningoencephalitis, a condition so uncommon in adults that most doctors had never seen a single case in their entire careers. Inside his skull, the infection was spreading rapidly. Inside his brain, disrupting neural activity, shutting systems down. And the data coming back from his spinal fluid told a very clear story. This was a severe case, possibly fatal. At first, the doctors estimated a 10% chance of survival. This then dropped to around 2%. And then something even worse, no chance of any meaningful recovery. He was placed in a ventilator. He was unconscious, unresponsive, and according to medical scoring system in intensive care, his brain function had dropped to dangerously low levels, at times scoring below 6, sometimes even lower. To put this in perspective, a fully conscious person scores 15, and a corpse scores 3. He was hovering just above the threshold of that of a corpse. He would later claim that years later, during this period, his brain, particularly the neocortex, The part responsible for thoughts, identity, and awareness was effectively offline. And yet he says something else was happening, something that, according to everything that he had ever believed, should have been impossible. While this was happening, his family had gathered around him. They were watching, they were waiting, and they were hoping for any sign of improvement. But none came. Behind closed doors, doctors had already been preparing them for the worst, because cases like this don't normally end in recovery. On the seventh day, a decision was announced, whether to stop treatment or whether to let him go. Outside the room, his young son overheard the conversation. He wasn't supposed to, but he did. And what he heard changed what happened next. His son ran into the room and tried to open his eyes. And after that, Eben woke up. Now, when he finally woke up, he couldn't speak. He didn't recognize his family. He didn't really know who he was, but somehow he remembered something else. Something he insists was more real than this reality that we are currently experiencing. When Eben Alexander opened his eyes in the ICU room, it should have been a moment of relief. Instead, it was confusion, total confusion, because the man lying in the hospital bed had no idea who he was, no idea who the people around him were, no language, no identity, no memory of his own life. He would later describe it as being dropped into the world as a blank slate. Then the story takes a strange turn, because in most near-death experiences, people can remember who they are. They carry their identity into whatever context. But in this case, everything was gone. No childhood, no career, no knowledge of science, no belief system, nothing. Yet he claims that something else remained: awareness. According to his account, the experience did not begin in some peaceful, heavenly place. It started somewhere else, somewhere dark. He described it as a kind of primitive state, like being trapped in something thick, almost alive. There was no clear thoughts, no sense of time, just existence in the most basic form. He would later call it an earthworm's eye view. Then something changed. Out of the darkness, a light appeared. Not just any light. Movement, rotation, and something even stranger: music. A sound he didn't hear with his ears, but experienced directly. And that light pulled him upwards. What came next is the part of the story that made headlines. He described emerging into a place that felt perfect. Not like Earth, but better, with vast green landscapes, water, flowers, movement everywhere, thousands of beings, some human-like, some not, all existing in a state of pure joy, no pain, no fear, no decay. And then there was someone with him, a woman. He said that she was with him from the beginning of this place, not speaking, but communicating directly, without words. And the message she gave him was simple: you are loved, you are safe, you have nothing to fear. At the time, he didn't know who she was, but that would change later on. As he moved through this place, he began to understand something else. There were no bodies, not really, no physical limits. He described himself as a point of awareness, and communication didn't happen through speech. It was immediate, shared, as if everything was connected. And just like before, the scene shifted again. This time, everything collapsed. The landscape disappeared, the beings were gone, and he found himself somewhere else entirely. He described it as infinite, black, but not empty. This is known as the core, filled with something he struggled to put in words: a presence, a force, something that felt like the source of everything. And within that space, he experienced what he would later describe as complete unity. No separation, no self versus others, no good versus evil, just existence, connected. Inside that space, he says that he was shown something. Not visually, not as a lecture, but as direct, understanding that consciousness does not come from the brain. The brain is more like a filter. Reality is fundamentally based on awareness. These ideas would later come to the forefront of everything he wrote. But that experience didn't follow a straight line. He describes a loop, moving between these states, back and forth from primitive darkness to the valley of light, to the core, to the light, as though he was being shown different layers of reality. And then at some point during this experience, he was told something. He was told, not in words, but in certainty, that he wasn't supposed to stay and that he would have to go back. Around this time, back in the hospital, something else was happening. His son was speaking to him, begging him to come back. Even though he couldn't hear anything physically, he claims that he heard the message, not through sound, but through something else. As the experience began to end, he described something strange. He was pulled back, not gently, but abruptly. The deeper states disappeared, the connection failed, and he was returned to that first primitive darkness. By this time, something was different. He said he could feel something coming from the outside, something that he interpreted as prayer. Weeks later, after he had regained his memory, after he had relearned language, after he understood who he was again, he saw a photograph. And in that photograph was a woman, the one from the experience, the one who had been with him during the entire time. And according to him, it was his biological sister, a woman who he had never met in his life, who had died years earlier. Then he went public. He wrote a book, spoke in interviews, presented his case to the world. And one of the central arguments remained consistent, that his brain had been too damaged to generate any type of complex experience. He pointed to medical data, to those coma scores, to case reports, including one published year later, which supported how severe his condition may have been. What truly shocked people was that once his mind returned, he did not go back to his old beliefs. He rejected them completely. He began arguing that the brain does not create consciousness, it filters it. And what we experience as reality is only part of something much bigger. In fact, this seemed like something of a philosophical shift, but then the ideas started expanding. He began describing consciousness as something fundamental, not produced by neurons, not dependent on a body, but something that exists before the brain and continues after it. And from then on, he introduced a concept that would become central to everything he said afterwards, that all consciousness is connected, that every thought, every person, every experience is part of a single shared system, one mind. According to him, the brain doesn't generate awareness, it just tunes in like a receiver. Each person has a slightly different version of the same underlying reality. But he didn't stop there, because once you remove consciousness from the brain, a new question appears. What happens after death? And his answer was clear. He began openly claiming that consciousness doesn't just continue, it returns, that human life is not part of a single event, but part of a cycle. He described a process where the soul leaves the body, returns to a non-physical state, where it reflects, learns, and then comes back again and again. He explained that during his experience, he didn't relive his own life because he had no memory of it. Instead, he saw something else, a type of system. He described it using imagery, like beings moving in and out of existence, like fish leaving water, then returning, or threads woven together into a massive interconnected structure. Each thread representing a life, each crossing point, a relationship, a consequence, a shared experience. And within that system, he believed that there was one rule above all else, that actions don't just affect others, they return to you, not metaphorically, but literally. He described something similar to what other NDEs report as a life review, where actions are experienced again, but from the perspective of others. Meaning, if you cause pain, you feel pain. If you show love, you feel that too. For this, he argued that something even more extreme, that morality is not a human invention, but built into the fiber and structure of reality itself. What he would call the golden rule. It isn't just advice, it is how the system works. But here where it becomes even more complex, because despite describing the structured system, he insisted that humans still have free will, that lives may include predetermined challenges, key relationships, and moments of difficulty. But it is how you respond that matters. Now, after Eben Alexander shared his story, scientists didn't ignore it. They examined it, and they examined it closely, because this wasn't just any claim. This was a trained neurosurgeon arguing against the foundation of the field, and that demanded an answer. The first explanation was also simple, that his brain was never completely offline. Yes, it was severely impaired. Yes, the infection was extreme, but impairness is not the same as absence. Even in deep coma states, the brain can still process internally, generate imagery, and produce fragmented awareness. And crucially, he recorded scores that were low, but they were not corpse level, which means there was still activity, still some form of function, still the possibility of experience. This leads to the second issue. When did this experience actually happen? Because from the outside, we assume it happened during the deepest parts of the coma. But from a neurological perspective, there are other windows as the brain is shutting down, during unstable fluctuations in consciousness, as well as perhaps when it was recovering, moments where the brain is disorganized and highly active. And those moments can generate vivid internal worlds. There's also a growing body of research that suggests that as the brain approaches death, it doesn't simply fade out. In some cases, it surges. A sudden burst of synchronized activity, heightened signaling, a kind of final cascade. And during that state, the brain may attempt to organize chaos, create coherence, and simulate a reality, which could explain the structured environments, the sense of movement, and the feeling of meaning. This is where everything collides, because every scientific explanation accounts for parts of this experience, but none of them fully explain all of it. At the same time, his explanation fills the gaps, but introduces something that cannot be fully explained. So now there are two ways to see this. Either a damaged brain creates a powerful illusion using everything it had left, or the brain wasn't creating anything at all. It was simply no longer blocking something. Because in the end, this story doesn't prove what happens after death, but it does expose something far more uncomfortable, that we still don't fully understand what happens in the brain when it begins to shut down. And until we do, every case like this will sit right on the edge between science and the unexplained.